If you're our guest, my name is Bryan. I'm the lead pastor here at Lifeline. We're really glad that you're here for Good Friday service. We try to do one each year and rally around the cross, and I'm super glad that you decided to join us tonight if you regularly attend Lifeline or if you don't. So, welcome. You've got Bibles in front of you on the chairs in front of you. If you don't have a Bible, just grab it. You'll want to make sure that you have a copy with you. If you have been new to Lifeline and you say, am I sure that's our pastor up in front? He does not have a beard any longer. Yes, it is indeed me. I was attacked by a wild razor. Her name is Jennifer. She won. All right, she won. No, it's good. I feel youthful. Whatever you live for is your king. I was listening to sports radio this morning, and a really prominent former athlete, he's a celebrity, was on and being interviewed. And I've always kind of liked him because he just kind of is raw and just tells you what he really thinks. And he was talking about athletes making all kinds of money, and he was referencing a particular subset of athletes that one particular athlete was making $200 million on a contract. $200 million. That's extraordinary. And he said, I'd do anything for $200 million. I'd go anywhere for $200 million. And then he said, I'm pretty sure I'm already going to hell anyway. And if somebody paid me $200 million, I'd for sure take the $200 million and go to hell. Now, I don't believe for 1 minute that he said that for much more than an effect. And the reason why is because I don't think he believes there is a heaven and there is a hell. I don't think he takes it seriously at all. What it actually betrayed was not so much some type of metaphysical concept that he has about the afterlife. It demonstrated that what drove the ship and drives the ship in his life is the almighty dollar. That's what he lives for. That means that money is his king. When you wring your hands and you wake up and you check your phone and you can hardly get past the news. Careful, it might be your king. It might be governing your mood, creating your disposition, and you might find that the very thing that you don't want to live under is the very thing you're living under, the body politic, and it's governing you. It's your king. When you are a workaholic and you can't ever turn it off, perhaps for you, the corporation's your king. When you find yourself completely dejected, wasted in life because the things that you dreamed about that would happen, the family that you envisioned is not what you wanted it to be, beware those expectations might be king. Right? When we come to this Good Friday context, we're talking about the gospel of the King. If you're not an attender at Lifeline, you should know this Good Friday service is actually in a 5-part series. This is number two in a 5-part series about kingship and about what it means for us to orient ourselves to a king who brings good news. Tonight, we're going to think about the king who dies. And Owen did a wonderful job reading for us, and there was one particular verse that Owen read that is the key verse for the central text of the crucifixion. It's not actually in the text that I'm going to read to you and that we're going to talk about. It's verse 11 in chapter 27. And verse 11 in chapter 27 says, Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, Are you the king of the Jews? Jesus said, You've said so. He lets it hang. Matthew, in constructing his discussion of the crucifixion, uses the idea of Jesus as King of the Jews as the central motif upon which he operates and upon which he discusses and lays out for us his narrative with all its details. What I want you to do is look with me in verse 27. Verse 27. And as we go through this, we're going to see sort of 3 steps of kingship unfolded a little bit. That he's trying to give us a picture of aspects driving to an end in verse really 54 is where it culminates. But verse 27, then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole battalion before him. Well, cohort, if it's the whole thing, and he doesn't mean there's no representative language here of just heads of the cohort. If it's the whole cohort, that would be 600 people sort of gathered in an assembly. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And in some ways, that language there of scarlet robe is almost too ostentatious of a translation. There's a longer robe they could have put on him called a hemation, and that's not what they put on him. They grabbed what would have been, the Greek word is a word for like a Roman military cloak that just would have gone over the top half of you, and they grabbed that. What you need to note about that is they're just using props that are at hand. What they're creating is a mock ceremony for a king. So they're grabbing what's right at hand. So they grabbed the small cloak, the military cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head. And put a reed in his right, not a staff, but a reed like a little piece of cane, like a little piece of, would be like a little piece of bamboo, something like that. They put it in his hand. And kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." And of course, for Matthew, this is utterly ironic. They will say, "Hail, King of the Jews." And that's precisely what he came to be in one sense, but was rejected. He indeed is a king, but not in the manner that they are portraying him. And they spit on him and took the reed, struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him and led him away to crucify him. Verse 27 through 31 is the Roman mocking of Jesus, and they create this mock enthronement ceremony with props around them, set him up in front of 600 soldiers to laugh at him and to deride him and to bring him low. The real biting stuff doesn't come from the Romans, though. The real biting stuff comes from the Jews, because the Jews are the ones who have the axe to grind with him. And they're the ones who he came and offered a kingdom to, and they rejected him. And so you pick up this derision of the Jews in verse 32 through 44. As they went out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. They compelled, and the Greek word for compelled, by the way, was actually morphed in culture as a kind of proper term for a Roman practice of co-opting sometimes a mule, sometimes transportation, and sometimes people for the purpose of any kind of Roman corporate enterprise. It could be travel, it could be moving goods, it could be enlisting somebody in militaristic enterprises, what have you. And so they grab him, this man Simon, it says to carry his cross. I just want you to notice 2 things. One thing, right before I mention both of those, just think with me for a moment. As you study the Bible, I don't know if you've experienced this, but the literature is multi-layered. It's so layered that right when you think you have most of it, you dig down deeper and there's more, and you dig down deeper and there's more, and there's all kinds of allusions and connections and all kinds of stuff, right? Jesus told his disciples that if they were going to be a disciple, what did they need to do? They needed to carry his cross. There was one disciple who said, "Listen, if everybody else goes away, I won't." His name was Simon. Now, Matthew, in an ironic twist, highlights the name of one who really does physically carry the cross, almost as a kind of wink at a Simon who decided in the crucial moment to not carry the cross. And here's Simon, and why is he mentioned by name? Well, probably that reason, and the other is that he would have been known in the early Christian community that would have received the Gospel of Matthew, because it's highly likely, with him being mentioned here, that from this moment he became somewhat known within the Christian community himself. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull, they offered him wine to drink mixed with gall, but when he tasted it, he would not drink it. Why was it called the place of the skull? It's called the place of the skull most likely because that's where people died. That's why it was called the place of the skull. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, no, I've heard before that it's called the place of the skull because there's rock formations and the mountain looks like a skull. Well, here's the thing. I've been twice now to Israel, to the location where that sort of got birthed from. It was called Gordon's Calvary. If you go to Israel and you tour, you'll go to two places potentially where the crucifixion and resurrection happened. One of them it almost certainly did not happen at, and one of them it almost certainly did happen at. The one that it almost certainly did happen at is the one that you will hope it didn't happen at. Right? Because when you go to the one that it didn't happen at, it's beautiful, it's a garden, it's the tomb. It's when you go Google online and you go, resurrection of Jesus, it's the tomb that comes up with the rock and roll. It looks garden, it's beautiful. And I can just see Mary there in the garden. It didn't happen there. Right outside of there is this place called, that was the place of the skull, Gordon's Calvary. And I've looked at it now twice and stared at it, and for the life of me, I can't see a skull. Now, I know other people look at it like, don't you see it's there? I think you're seeing what you want to see. And I've seen pictures of it from when Gordon found it, and it didn't look like a skull then either. Right? It's called the place of the skull because that's where people were killed. Right? It's located approximately where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is now within the confines of the old city of Jerusalem. They offered him wine to drink, mixed with gall, but when he tasted it, he would not drink it. And when they had crucified him, they divided his garments among them by casting lots. By casting lots. One of the things that's interesting in this text is that oftentimes, especially, Matthew does this a lot because his audience is very Hebrew. And Matthew pulls in a lot of Old Testament texts, and there's a text that runs right underneath the crucifixion narrative here. It's Psalm 22, and he makes all kinds of connections to it along the way. Here, they're taking his garments and they're casting lots. Psalm 22:18 says, they divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Jesus himself is going to quote from Psalm 22 on the cross in a minute. Verse 36, then they sat down, kept watch over him there. And over his head, they put the charge against him, which read, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. Why did they put it up over his head? And they put it up over his head so that the message was sent to anybody who thought that they might contribute in any way to any concept of insurrection against the Roman authorities. You should think twice. You should think twice. So they put that up there. Then two robbers, the word is lestai. It's an important word. The word robber probably best rendered like a bandit. Think like the guys that hoodwink the guy who ends up being treated by the Good Samaritan, right? The bandits, that way. When Barabbas is released, Barabbas in a different gospel is referred to by the same term. He's a lestai. He's an insurrectionist. So scholars look and have rightly asserted that more than likely what you have is Jesus being crucified, and on each side of him are two men who participated along with Barabbas in the insurrection, given that the same term is used of Barabbas himself, and that Jesus is on the cross that Pilate would have anticipated Barabbas being on. And now, add to that the irony that some hoped he was coming as a militaristic insurrectionist ruler, but he came as the antithesis of that, and now he's crucified on a cross where a real insurrectionist should have been. Right? And so here he is, these robbers on each side. One on the right, one on the left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads. There are three groups. And the reason Matthew does this is he's showing us that the Jews in total are rejecting him. The passersby represent the common person. The religious leaders, and then even the criminals, even the insurrectionists. The lowest, the middle of the road, and the highest are all rejecting him. Watch what the passersby say. Wagging their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself." Hey, hot stuff. You thought you were all that. You were going to destroy the temple. In fact, after you came in Matthew's gospel, you came in on a colt. You went straight into the temple and cleansed the temple. Right? They're referring here to his words in John 2, 19 through 22. Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. Jesus actually said, interestingly, in Matthew 12:6 to a group of Pharisees, as he was disputing with them about the Sabbath, he said, "I tell you something," referring to himself, "something greater than the temple is here." The irony in their words is that they attribute to him this notion that he wanted to come and physically tear down the temple, which was not what he was wanting to do at all. But they miss the truth that he was nullifying the need for the temple. Because what he was saying is, you won't need that any longer. One greater than the temple is here. That will no longer be the gateway to God. That will no longer be the access point. That will no longer be the epicenter of worship. Instead, I'll make a way. So he is, in that way, nullifying. Not in the way that they say. There's a lot of irony that's being imported here. If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross. If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross. Interestingly, when Matthew begins Jesus' ministry, somebody says, "If you're the Son of God." If you're the Son of God to him. In Matthew 4. You remember that? And the tempter came and said to him, "If you're the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." Then the devil took him to the holy city and set him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, "If you're the Son of God, throw yourself down." You remember those verses. They're going to be important, very important as we close. If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross. They're parroting the evil one's words. So also the chief priests, with the scribes and elders, the religious leaders, mocked him, saying, "He saved others. He cannot save himself." Right? It was a week ago. Hosanna, Hosanna, Lord save, coming out of Psalm 118, this king coming in the acknowledgement that God is the one who gives victory. Here comes Jesus on the colt, and they say, "Lord save, Lord save." And now they turn that and they twist that. He who saved others, let him save himself now. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. No, they won't. They already made up their mind. This is disingenuous. They're already set in their ways. They're looking for a parlor trick, if anything, right? In John's rendition of the triumphal entry, we looked at Matthew's last Sunday. 2 verses into that triumphal entry, we read in John's gospel, "So they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him, crying out, 'Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" So the Lord saved, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel. And now, the religious leaders who were suspicious about him, even as the masses from Galilee chanted that, the religious leaders now pick that up and go, "Save yourself. You really the King of Israel?" He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now if he desires. Let God deliver him now. Psalm 22:8. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. It's another allusion to Psalm 22. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now if he desires him, for he said, "I am the Son of God," and the robbers who were crucified with him also reviled him in the same way. He's a derided king. Now, Jesus can endure the mockings. Jesus came expecting to be rejected. Jesus came expecting. There's no surprises there. The greater weight of what happens in the crucifixion is something that happens in kind of this mystery of the Father and Son in the context of him bearing the weight of our shame and our guilt. And it moves him from a derided king to a desolate king. If you'll look in verse 45, "Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, about 3 p.m., 'Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani,' in Aramaic, that is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So the bystanders hearing it said, "This man is calling Elijah." And one of them at once ran, took a sponge, filled it with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink. But the others said, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. We don't know in verse 50 what he cried, but it might well be that he cried what Luke 23:46 says, "Then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said, 'Father, into your hands I commit my spirit.' And having said this, he breathed his last." Now, he quotes Psalm 22, verse 1. That's what he quotes as he's dying on the cross. Why does he quote that? What is the point of that statement? We could spend weeks thinking about that phrase. Not just from the standpoint of what it meant in terms of Christ and his rescue of you and me on the cross in that moment, and what it meant in terms of the weight of anguish, the weight of sin, and even what it meant by way of implications with the Father and Son and Trinity and so forth. But even what it means by way of how you suffer and how you experience being forsaken and how you hold on to faith at the same time. See, think about the statement. You have forsaken me. And yet you have forsaken me, and what does he say? My God. My God. By the time he's done, he prays, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." See, faith and being forsaken commingle in the context of the sufferings of Christ. Now, what does all that mean in regard to Father and Son? And lots of times we kind of get out over our skis. At one level, there's a mystery that Trinity wasn't broken up somehow on the cross. And yet, Is there a sense in which it seems like fellowship was not, as one writer says, not done away with, but dimmed in some way? Well, Leon Morris, Australian exegete, said the following, and I like the statement: in the working out of salvation for sinners, the hitherto unbroken communion between the Father and the Son was mysteriously broken. It's surely better to accept this, knowing that we do not understand it fully, than to attempt some rationalization of the saying so that it become more palatable to the prejudice of modern Westerners. We got to figure it all out. No, in some way, Jesus isn't lying. He really felt forsaken. And yet, at the same time, he can say, no, you're my God. You're my God. See, you march in your life constantly in a world of suffering where you're tempted to ask questions about God's felt presence and distance from you, or the pressure of life on you, and you might even feel forsaken. In that context, you need to be reminded that he still is your God. Your God. He's your Father. And the Christian life is in many ways wrestling with forsakenness and feelings of forsakenness on one side, and fatherhood on the other. And you walk with those in lockstep. And Jesus here, in bearing your shame, in bearing your sin, takes on that which was not his own, but is looked at as though he had done it himself, even though he had not done it himself. And in that way is your substitute atoning for you, and cries out in the anguish of that, my God, why have you forsaken me? And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now, only one person could tear it from top to bottom. Right? God tears it from top to bottom. Now, which curtain is it? We don't really know, because there were two curtains. There's the one that goes from the holy place to the Holy of Holies, and I think oftentimes that's where we run to think that that's the one that was torn, and I think because of its significance, the movement into that place that is the Holy of Holies. But I actually think it's probably not that curtain, because that curtain would not have been visible to everyone. But there was another curtain that went from the general sanctuary into the holy place. There, that would have been visible. That would have been public. Because the symbolism has to do with access to God, and the symbolism has to do possibly with future destruction of the temple, and the symbolism has to do with that temple that he was allegedly going to destroy is now antiquated. There's no need for that anymore. We don't have to access God that way. Things are different now, torn from top to bottom. And the earth shook, and the rocks were split. And what you don't see in English is that the Greek term's the same. The curtain's torn, and the rocks are torn as well. God's just tearing everything up. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep, saints that were dead, were raised and coming out of the tombs after his resurrection. Not then, not at that moment, but after his resurrection. Why would he put that in there? There's really two things to note. Why would he say it to begin with? Well, because it really happened. That's one reason. But other than that, it really happened. Because he wants us to be loaded when we get to resurrection, to realize that the resurrection of Jesus is a harbinger of the resurrection of others. Right? So after others are risen. But why does he say it here now? Because I think Matthew's trying to point something out to us. That when he gets to the resurrection, and we talk about Sunday, of course it's life-giving. He is risen. Wonderful. We are raised to walk in newness of life. But Matthew wants us to know that there's a connection point to you rising in life that is tied off to the fact of what Christ did in his death. That life emerges because of his death. That the kernel of wheat that falls to the ground here does not just abide alone. Instead, it produces fruit, kingdom fruit. When the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, so these Roman soldiers. Now, don't over-theologize the Roman soldiers. I don't think they knew what in the world they were even saying. The Roman soldiers had a view of deity that was radically different than the Jews. The Roman soldiers thought that the gods came down at various points, had sex with various women, had children that were unique, special, superhuman type beings of sorts. They were the ones who rose to become kings, right? So it may just be that as they look, they're thinking in their minds, man, that guy is special. That may be what they're thinking. That is not what Matthew means by it. Matthew's loading the dice here. Why? Because remember, where did he start Jesus' ministry? He started Jesus' ministry with the devil saying, if you're the Son of God, do this. If you're the Son of God, do this. Let's play parlor tricks, and if you do them, you'll show your deity. He bookends theologically his gospel with, truly this was the Son of God. See that? He begins questioned by the devil. He ends vindicated by his death. That he was, in fact, the definitive king. There were also many women there, looking on from a distance, who had followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. It's important to mention them because they're the link to what we'll talk about Sunday. They're watching, they're seeing, they're waiting, they're haunted by what they see, not fully grasping it. But Sunday's coming. And they'll know. And they'll encounter him. And their life will never be the same because of it.